Boker Tov, everyone, and welcome to this week's Taste of Torah. We are on the very last week of this Jewish year, and it's the last Torah portion that we'll look at during 5781. There are three more texts to go, or portions to go, but they will occur over the High Holy Days, and we will start over again at the holiday of Simchat Torah. So the Torah portions are not completely aligned to go with the beginning and end of the year. That has always been the case. And but what always happens is that our Torah portion this week, Nitzavim, appears on the very last week. Now, I started out with a college student film experiment called Repentance. And if you found it ambiguous, I think the author intended you to. It poses an interesting moment. It's set in appears to be the American West. So the preparing to shoot and learning to shoot, of course, is always the precursor to the quest for revenge. Right? How many scenes have we ever seen of someone practicing their six-gun or their Winchester with the intention of going out and seeking revenge? I think immediately of Django. There have been many other films with that kind of motif going on in it. But this takes a slightly different turn, even though it does suggest that there is some anger and loss. What happens is that he fails to hit his targets. He puts on a pair of glasses, and then he starts over again. I actually think that's a pretty Jewish story, because for those of you not familiar with the Hebrew word for sin, that word is chata, and it comes from a root of a verb that means to miss a target. When loosing arrows at a target, you can chata, you can miss. And so the word for sin literally means miss the target, which of course is exactly what's happening to the character in the film. Now, interestingly enough, when he fails in his efforts to hit his target, what does he do? He puts on glasses, gets a new perspective, and starts over again, trying to hit his target. I think that's actually a wonderful illustration of the Jewish relationship between sin and repentance. And as we come into the High Holy Days, I think this is a wonderful film to look at. And in fact, I think the creator of this film, I'm going to be stereotypical here and judge based on his name, is Jewish and probably was inspired by the Jewish notion of tshuva, or repentance. But let's get back to our Torah portion. Our Torah portion always on this week before Rosh Hashanah is called Nitzavim. And it's actually part of a double portion in some years. It's one of those accordion portions that can be doubled up or can be extended. In this case, it's extended, so we just get a single portion. And it's most striking that this is the portion that we return to and read on Yom Kippur afternoon. Why? Well, it has this moment in it, a most important moment from a Jewish perspective, that we made a covenant at Mount Sinai, and we've been wandering now for 40 years in preparation for entering the land of Israel, the promised land, the land promised to our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and Isaac and Jacob. So, and at this moment, Moses chooses to revisit the idea of the covenant. Why? Well, because a vast proportion of the people now, 40 years later, are no longer people who were direct witnesses to Mount Sinai. Maybe the older people 40 years ago were children at the foot of Mount Sinai, but if you're younger than 40 years, this is not a shared memory. So Moses offers a very, very important speech in which he says, I'm here to renew this covenant with you, both for those who are standing here this day, and most importantly, for those who are not standing here this day, reminding us that there are some commitments, some values, some contracts that extend beyond the lifetime of the individual who makes them. Anyone who's familiar with contracts and law knows that this is the case, that the heir to property can be subject to a contract that he didn't make, that his father or mother or ancestor didn't make. So as a matter of law, that's fairly logical. But in terms of a whole people, I might point to the notion of citizenship. The fact of the matter is, none of us wrote the Constitution, none of us created the laws that define what it is to be an American, and yet by being born on this land, being born to those people who are citizens of the United States, we still find ourselves obligated. Even though I didn't agree to anything, if I were to go out and cut a deal with the Chinese government against the government of the United States, or with Vladimir Putin against the government of the United States, I would be rightly accused of treason and sedition. That's how it works. We find ourselves bound by obligations that we were not direct party to. But there's more to this portion than just this idea of the ongoing obligation of Jewish identity. There is a wonderful speech that Moses says, Lo b'shamayim hi is the phrase that I always remember. It is not in heaven. What does Moses say? He says rhetorically to the people, you have this Torah. It is not in heaven. That you might have to say to each other, let's send someone up to heaven to get it, that he could bring it to us, that we might observe it. And then he goes on to say, it's not across the sea, that it is in such a place beyond us that we have to choose to send someone to go get the Torah and bring it to us so that we might observe it. And Moses goes on like this for a little bit, but his point is this. He says, no, this thing is in your hand and in your heart for you to do. So the first thing that's being said here is the idea that the Torah is accessible to anybody and everybody, and that we are obligated to observe it. But it gets even more complicated than that. What happens if we don't? Not out of malice or out of ill intent, but we simply neglect or we fail, we miss the target in our attempts to live by the Torah. What happens to us then? Are we doomed? Interestingly enough, that was one of the arguments of Paul of Tarsus, that we are given many, many commandments. No one can possibly fulfill them all, and therefore we are a priori guilty of failure. And so the only reason God gave us the Torah is just to teach us that we can't live by the Torah, which is quite a paradox. It makes God something of a trickster God who decides to humiliate us as a way of teaching us. But of course, that's not the nature of the covenant, because built into the covenant is tshuva, turning around, starting over, Having missed the target, you go back to the starting point, reload, and keep trying. All right. And Shuva is the essence of what is going to happen in the next week, is that we are going to embrace the high holy days. We are going to strive to look at the past honestly, recognize what we've done right, but especially recognize where we've missed the target and how can we improve our aim in the year ahead. The metaphor, if I'm to borrow from our little clip, put your glasses on more firmly on your face, all right? Get clarity. Use Torah as a prism through which to look at your life. And by doing that, you may well hit the target the next time. So both our little student film exercise, but our Torah portion also has built into it all the mechanisms by which we can live a life in relationship with God. It's not too hard for us, says Torah. It's Moses, forgive me. It's not too hard for us to live by the Torah. It's not impossible. We will falter, but there's always teshuvah and a lifetime to strive to do better. And so each and every year, because we're not first trial learners, rarely can we hit the target every time, the first time we ever try. We are given a lifetime of opportunities to improve our aim, strive to be on point, and to achieve the effort to become the kind of people we want to be. So that's what our Torah portion is teaching us this week. And it will come back to revisit us on Yom Kippur. And I hope that what I've had to say here may be helpful for you when you think about the reading of that portion on Yom Kippur afternoon. Everybody have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.